Her son locked her out, but the dog refused to leave one wall in a $1 schoolhouse. The key didn't work anymore. Marlene stood on the porch she once called home, her suitcase already packed for her, like someone had planned this moment long before she arrived. Hours later, she found herself standing in a forgotten schoolhouse no one wanted, except her dog. Because the second he stepped inside, he stopped and wouldn't leave one wall alone. What would you have done if you were standing on that porch with nowhere to go? The driveway looked the same. That was the first thing Marlene noticed. Same cracked line running down the middle where weeds pushed through every summer. Same dent in the mailbox from when her husband backed into it 15 years ago and never quite fixed it right. Even the wind sounded familiar, dragging itself through the trees at the edge of the yard in that slow, restless way. Nothing about the place suggested it had changed. And yet, something had. Marlene stood at the bottom of the porch steps, one hand wrapped around the handle of her old suitcase. The fabric was worn thin at the corners, threads showing where it had rubbed against years of use. It wasn't heavy. That, more than anything, made her uneasy. Rex stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat from his body against her leg. He wasn't pacing, wasn't sniffing around like he usually did when they came somewhere familiar. He was still. Too still. His ears were angled forward, not in excitement, but in focus. His eyes stayed fixed on the house, not the yard, not the road, the house itself. Marlene took a step up onto the porch. The wood creaked under her weight, the same soft complaint it had always made. She paused for a moment, her hand hovering near the doorframe. There was a faint smell of something she couldn't place. Not strong, just different. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her key. It was the same brass key she had used for years, worn smooth along the edges, the grooves familiar against her thumb. She held it for a second longer than necessary, then slid it into the lock. It didn't go in. She tried again, turned it slightly, pressed a little harder. Nothing. The key stopped halfway, like it had hit something solid that didn't belong there. Marlene frowned, pulling it back out and looking at it as if the metal itself had changed. Then she looked at the lock. It was new. Not brand new. There were already faint scratches around the keyhole, but newer than anything else on that door. The brass was brighter, the edges sharper. It didn't match the rest of the house. For a moment, she just stood there. Then she knocked. Not loud, just enough. The sound was dull against the wood. She waited. Inside, something shifted. A faint movement. Maybe footsteps. Maybe just the settling of the house. It was hard to tell. Rex's body tensed slightly beside her. Marlene knocked again, a little firmer this time. "Hello?" she called, her voice steady, almost polite. There was a pause, long enough to notice. Then, through the thin curtain in the front window, she saw it. A shadow passing across the room. Someone was inside. She knew the shape of that movement, the way a person crossed from one side of the room to the other without looking toward the door, without stopping, without opening it. Marlene felt something shift in her chest, not sharp, not sudden, just a quiet, steady understanding beginning to settle in. She stepped back from the door. That's when she saw the suitcase. It was sitting off to the side of the porch, near the railing, not where she had left it earlier that morning when she'd gone into town. This one was closed, zipped all the way, the handle folded down neatly. It hadn't been dropped there. It had been placed. Carefully. Marlene walked over to it slowly, each step measured. She crouched down, resting one hand on the top of the case. The fabric felt cool under her palm. She didn't open it right away. She didn't need to. She already knew what was inside. Clothes, a few folded sweaters, her shoes, the framed photograph she kept on the dresser. She could almost picture it now, wrapped in something soft so the glass wouldn't crack. Maybe the small box of things she never threw away but never used either. Only the things that were hers. Nothing else. Behind her, the curtain shifted again. Marlene turned her head slightly, just enough to see the window out of the corner of her eye. No one came to the door. No one called her name. Rex let out a slow breath. Not a growl, not a bark. Just a quiet exhale through his nose, his body still tight, eyes locked on the same spot. Marlene stood up. The porch felt smaller now, the air heavier. She walked back to the door and placed her hand flat against it. The wood was warm from the afternoon sun, but it didn't feel like hers anymore, not in the way it used to. She didn't knock again. Instead, she stood there for a moment longer, her hand resting on the surface, as if she could feel something through it, something familiar, something that used to be there. But there was nothing. Just the faint echo of movement on the other side. Someone choosing not to answer. Marlene lowered her hand. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees, carrying the dry sound of leaves skimming across the driveway. Somewhere down the road, a car passed, its engine fading quickly into the distance. Everything else stayed quiet. Too quiet. She picked up the suitcase. The handle clicked into place with a small, final sound. Rex moved then, stepping closer to her side, his shoulder brushing against her leg. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the house until she turned away. Only then did he follow. They walked down the steps together. Marlene didn't look back right away. Not until she reached the edge of the driveway. She turned once. The house stood exactly as it always had. Same windows, same roof, same porch. But the door remained closed, and no one came out. Rex stopped beside her again, just for a second, his ears still angled toward the house, his body alert in a way she hadn't seen before. Then he turned with her. And together, without another word, they walked away. The gravel shifted under their steps, a dry, uneven sound that followed them to the road. Marlene didn't hurry. There was nowhere to hurry to. The suitcase rolled behind her with a soft, steady rattle, one wheel slightly off-center, catching now and then on loose stones. Rex stayed close, closer than usual. They reached the end of the driveway, and for a moment, she stood there, looking at the road as if expecting it to offer something. Direction, maybe, or at least a reason. It didn't. The sky had that late afternoon color that came just before the light started to fade. Pale, washed out. The kind of sky that made everything feel quieter than it should. Marlene adjusted her grip on the suitcase handle. "All right," she said under her breath, though she wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. Rex glanced up at her, then back down the road. They started walking. It wasn't the first time she had felt something shifting beneath her feet. It had started years ago, not all at once, not anything you could point to and say, "There." That's when it changed. It had been smaller than that. A conversation cut short. A signature added to a document she didn't fully read. A sentence that began with, "It'll just make things easier, Mom." At the time, it had made sense. Her husband had been gone for 3 years by then. The house had felt too big, too quiet. Bills came in thicker stacks than they used to, and numbers didn't stretch the way they once had. Her son Daniel had stepped in. He had always been good with numbers, organized, practical. "You don't need to worry about this anymore," he had said, sitting at the kitchen table with a folder spread out in front of him. "We'll just put it in my name for now. It's cleaner, easier to manage." Marlene had nodded. It hadn't felt like giving something away. It had felt like letting someone carry a box that had gotten too heavy. She signed where he pointed. After that, things didn't change right away. He still came by on Sundays, still brought groceries sometimes, still asked if she needed anything. But the visits got shorter, the questions got fewer. And slowly, almost without noticing, the house stopped feeling like it belonged to her. Not physically. Something quieter than that. A shift in tone, in permission. In the way Daniel stood in the doorway instead of stepping inside. In the way he began saying "my place" without correcting himself. Marlene had noticed it. She just hadn't said anything. The motel sat just off the highway, behind a row of overgrown bushes that had long since stopped being trimmed. The sign flickered, one of the letters half lit, so it read like a word missing its middle. VACNCY. Marlene parked in the gravel lot and turned off the engine. For a moment, she stayed still, hands resting on the steering wheel. Rex shifted in the passenger seat, his nails clicking softly against the plastic floor mat. He looked toward the building, then back at her. "It's just for a few nights," she said. Her voice sounded steady enough. Inside, the air smelled faintly of bleach layered over something older. Damp carpet, maybe, or wood that had absorbed too many years of passing through. The man at the front desk didn't ask questions. He slid a key across the counter and pointed toward the far end of the building. Room 12. The door stuck a little when she opened it. Inside, the room was small. One bed, a table, a chair pushed into the corner. The curtains were drawn halfway, letting in a narrow strip of light that fell across the carpet in a pale line. Marlene set the suitcase down at the foot of the bed. Rex stepped in behind her, moving slowly, his nose low, taking in the unfamiliar smells. He circled once, then settled near the door, lying down with his head up, not fully relaxed. Marlene sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped slightly under her weight. She looked around the room, taking in each detail without really focusing on any of them. The hum of the air unit, the faint sound of a television in the next room, a car door slamming somewhere outside. It felt temporary. Not in a comforting way, in a way that made everything feel thin. She reached down and pulled the suitcase open. Everything was there. Folded, packed, exactly as she had imagined it. Her clothes, her shoes, the photograph, wrapped in one of her sweaters, the glass intact. Marlene picked it up and held it for a moment. Then she set it carefully on the table. Rex lifted his head slightly, watching her. "I know," she said quietly. He didn't move. The first night passed slowly. Sleep came in pieces, broken by unfamiliar sounds. The creak of pipes, footsteps in the hallway, the distant thrum of traffic. Each time she woke, it took a second longer to remember where she was. And each time that same quiet understanding settled back in. By morning, the room felt smaller. Marlene stood at the sink, running water over her hands, watching it swirl down the drain. She dried them on a thin towel and looked at her reflection in the mirror. Nothing about her had changed. Same face, same lines, same steady eyes. But something behind them had shifted. Not broken. Just moved. Rex stood behind her, his reflection visible over her shoulder. He watched her the way he always had, calm, attentive, waiting. "Let's go," she said. They stepped outside into the morning air. Cool, clean, a little sharper than the night before. Marlene closed the door behind them and slipped the key into her pocket. She didn't look back at the room. She didn't need to. She already knew she wasn't going back. The morning carried a kind of stillness that made everything feel undecided. The sky was pale, stretched thin over the highway, and the air had that early chill that never quite warmed up, even after the sun came out. Marlene stood beside her car for a moment, one hand resting on the roof, as if grounding herself before moving again. Rex waited by the passenger door, not restless, just ready. She opened the door, and he climbed in without hesitation, settling into the seat with a quiet shift of weight. He watched her as she walked around to the driver's side, his eyes following every movement. Inside the car, it felt quieter than the motel. Cleaner, somehow. Marlene started the engine. The radio flickered on for a second. Static, then a fragment of a voice, before she reached over and turned it off. The silence felt easier to hold onto. She pulled out onto the road without a clear destination. Just driving. The county office sat in a low brick building near the edge of town. It wasn't somewhere Marlene had ever needed to go before. The parking lot was half empty, a few pickup trucks parked at angles that suggested people weren't staying long. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and something older, dust maybe, or wood that had soaked in decades of use. There were only two people at the counter. A man in a work jacket, leaning slightly forward, speaking in a low voice, and a woman behind the desk, flipping through a stack of forms with practiced ease. Marlene stepped up to the far end of the counter, giving them space. She didn't intend to listen. But the room was small, been sitting empty since the last auction, the man was saying. Nobody wants it. The woman shrugged without looking up. It's not exactly move-in ready. What is it? Old schoolhouse. Out past Ridgeline. Tax sale. $1 minimum just to clear it off the books. Marlene's hand stilled where it rested on the counter. $1. She didn't turn right away, just stood there, listening as if the conversation might continue. It didn't. The man shook his head slightly, muttered something under his breath, and walked out. The woman behind the desk looked up then, her eyes landing on Marlene. "Can I help you?" Marlene hesitated. It wasn't a long pause, just enough to feel it. "That schoolhouse," she said, "the one you mentioned." The woman leaned back slightly in her chair, studying her for a moment. "You serious?" Marlene nodded once. "It's not in great shape," the woman said. "Actually, that's putting it kindly. No utilities. Structure's been sitting a long time. Roof might hold, might not. You'd have to see it." "I'd like to." The woman reached for a drawer and pulled out a thin file, flipping it open. A few papers, a rough map, a photocopied photograph, faded at the edges. She slid it across the counter. "Out this way," she said, tapping the map with her pen. "About 30 minutes past the last gas station. Road gets narrow. You'll think you went too far." You didn't. Marlene looked down at the image. The building in the photo leaned slightly to one side. The paint had peeled in long strips. The windows were clouded, some boarded, some not. It looked less like a place people had left and more like a place people had forgotten. "How long's it been empty?" Marlene asked. "Decades," the woman said. "Closed down when they consolidated schools. Nobody's touched it since. It's just there." Marlene nodded slowly. "Okay." The woman raised an eyebrow. "You want to go see it first?" "I will." She folded the map carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket. "Take your time," the woman said. "It's not exactly a hot listing." Marlene gave a small nod and turned away. The road changed the farther she drove. Houses thinned out first, then fences, then anything that suggested people stayed there long enough to leave a mark. Mailboxes stood alone at the ends of long gravel drives. Some leaned slightly. Some had names faded almost completely away. Fields stretched out on either side, dry grass moving in slow waves under the wind. Rex shifted in his seat, his head lifting higher as the scenery changed. His eyes moved constantly now, tracking the edges of things, the tree line, the empty spaces between buildings, the bends in the road. Marlene drove without speaking. The map sat folded on the passenger seat beside him. She followed it without checking more than once. The woman had been right. The road narrowed. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to something rougher, less defined. The kind of road that felt more like a suggestion than a direction. For a moment, Marlene wondered if she had gone too far. Then she saw it. The schoolhouse sat back from the road, half hidden by tall grass and a line of trees that had grown in unevenly over the years. It wasn't large, not the way she had imagined. Just a single structure. Simple. Still. She pulled the car to a stop. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. Marlene didn't get out right away. She looked at the building through the windshield. The windows were dull with dust. The paint had faded to a color that didn't quite hold its name anymore. The roof sagged slightly at one corner, but it hadn't collapsed. It was still standing. Rex let out a quiet breath. Then he shifted forward. Marlene opened the door and stepped out onto the gravel. The air felt different here. Quieter. Not empty. Just untouched. Rex jumped down beside her and immediately paused. He didn't move forward. Didn't sniff the ground or circle the car. He stood still, his body angled slightly toward the building, his ears forward, his eyes fixed. Marlene glanced down at him. "It's okay," she said softly. But he didn't move. Not yet. She took a few steps toward the schoolhouse. The grass brushed against her legs, dry and brittle. The sound of it was sharp in the still air, louder than it should have been. After a moment, Rex followed. Slowly, each step deliberate. As they got closer, the details came into focus. The door hung slightly off-center but stayed closed. The frame was intact. The foundation, though worn, hadn't shifted beyond repair. It wasn't falling apart. It was just waiting. Marlene stopped a few feet from the entrance. Rex moved up beside her again, his shoulder close to her leg, his gaze never leaving the building. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Marlene reached out and placed her hand on the door. The wood was rough beneath her fingers. Not new, not welcoming, but solid. She stood there, her hand resting against it, feeling the quiet of the place settle around her. Behind her, the road stretched back the way they had come. Ahead of her, the door didn't open. Not yet. But it didn't turn her away either. Marlene took a breath and stayed. The door didn't open on its own. It needed a push. She pressed her palm against the wood and leaned forward just enough to feel resistance give way. The hinges let out a low, drawn-out sound, dry metal shifting after years of stillness. Not loud, just enough to mark that something had changed. The door moved inward a few inches. Cold air slipped out past her. Not the kind that bites, the kind that lingers, that's been sitting in a place too long without being disturbed. Marlene pushed a little more. The door opened wider, and the light followed it in. For a moment, she didn't step inside. She stood in the doorway, one hand still on the edge of the door, letting her eyes adjust. The room was smaller than she expected. One open space, no hallways, no divisions, just a single room that had once held more than it did now. Dust hung in the air, visible where the sunlight cut through the tall windows along the sides. The light didn't move quickly. It stretched, slow and steady, like it had been doing the same thing every day, whether anyone was there to see it or not. Rex stepped forward first. Not far, just past the threshold. His nails clicked softly against the wood floor, then stopped. He stood there, body still, head slightly lowered. His nose lifted once, catching something faint in the air. Then he turned his head, scanning the room in slow, careful movements. Marlene watched him for a second, then she stepped inside. The floor creaked under her weight. It wasn't a sharp sound, more like the building acknowledging her presence. She let the door rest behind her, not fully closed, just enough to quiet the outside world. Inside, the smell was different than she expected. Old wood, yes, dust, definitely, but underneath it, something softer. Paper, chalk, maybe even something faintly sweet, like dried leaves or sap that had settled into the boards over time. The desks were still there. 2 rows, uneven, some slightly turned as if someone had left in a hurry and never came back to straighten them. The surfaces were scratched, initials carved into corners, edges worn smooth by hands that had rested there long ago. Marlene moved closer. She ran her fingers lightly across one of the desks. The dust came away in a thin line. At the front of the room, the chalkboard stretched across the wall. Its surface was dull but intact, faint outlines of old writing barely visible if you looked at it the right way. Numbers. Words. Nothing clear enough to read. Just the suggestion that someone had stood there once and explained things that mattered. A rusted stove sat off to one side near the corner. The pipe ran up through the ceiling, angled slightly, as if it had shifted but decided to stay. The windows were tall. Taller than she expected. Even with the grime, they let in enough light to fill the room without needing anything else. The glass warped the view outside just slightly, bending the trees into shapes that didn't quite match reality. Rex moved again lowly. He walked along the edge of the room, not rushing, not exploring in the way he usually did when they entered a new place. His movements were deliberate, measured. He paused near one wall, his head turning slightly as if listening for something just beyond reach. Marlene noticed. She didn't say anything. She just watched. He stood there for a moment longer than seemed necessary, then moved on, circling back toward her. She exhaled quietly. The sound felt out of place in the stillness. She walked further into the room, her steps careful, as if the floor might change its mind about holding her weight. But it didn't. It held solid. More solid than it looked from the outside. Marlene turned slowly, taking in the space again, this time from the center. It wasn't comfortable. Not yet. But it wasn't broken either. That was the part she couldn't ignore. She had expected something worse, something that would make the decision for her. A collapsed roof, rot that went too deep, a structure that had already given up. But this place hadn't. It had just been left. There was a difference. Rex came back to her side and sat. Not lying down, not relaxing, just sitting, watching. His ears shifted once, then settled. Marlene looked down at him. "What do you think?" she asked softly. He didn't respond, of course. But he didn't look away from the room either. Marlene let her gaze drift back across the space. The chalkboard, the desks, the windows, the walls. She stepped closer to one of them, raising her hand and pressing her fingers lightly against the plaster. It was cool to the touch, firm but not new. There were small cracks, lines that had formed over time but hadn't spread. The building hadn't been cared for, but it hadn't been abandoned by itself. It was still here, still holding together, still waiting for something. Marlene lowered her hand. She turned toward the door. For a brief second, the thought crossed her mind. Leave now. Go back. Find something easier. Something finished. Something that didn't require this kind of quiet decision. But that thought didn't stay. It passed through her like the wind outside. Because there wasn't anything easier waiting. She already knew that. Marlene walked back to the doorway and looked out at the road. It hadn't changed. Still empty. Still distant. Still offering nothing. She stepped back inside. The door shifted slightly as she moved, the hinge settling again into place. Rex stood up beside her. This time he didn't hesitate. He stayed. Marlene looked around the room one more time, not searching, just seeing. Then she nodded, almost to herself. It wasn't a big gesture, barely noticeable, but it was enough. "All right," she said quietly. Her voice didn't echo. It settled into the room, like it belonged there. And for the first time since she had stepped onto the porch that morning, something inside her stopped moving. Not fixed, not certain, but steady enough. She turned toward the door again. There was still one thing left to do. Marlene stepped outside and pulled the door gently behind her until it rested in place. It didn't latch. It didn't need to. The wind moved across the field in a low sweep, bending the dry grass and carrying a faint rustling sound toward her. The sky had shifted slightly, the light thinner now, stretching longer shadows across the ground. She stood there for a moment, looking at the building from the outside again. It hadn't changed. Still leaning just enough to notice. Still worn. Still quiet. But now she had seen inside. That made it different. Rex came to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing lightly against her leg. He looked back at the door once, then toward the open field, scanning the distance before settling again. Marlene reached into her coat pocket and unfolded the map. Her fingers paused on the edge of it. Then she folded it back up, carefully. She didn't need it anymore. The next morning, she returned. The drive felt shorter this time. Or maybe it was just that she wasn't wondering where she was going anymore. The road narrowed the same way. The trees closed in the same way. The silence settled around the car the same way. But her hands on the wheel were steadier. Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, watching ahead. When the schoolhouse came into view, his posture shifted slightly, subtle, but enough to notice. Marlene parked in the same spot as before. The engine went quiet. This time she didn't wait. She stepped out, grabbed the suitcase from the back, and walked straight to the door. It opened easier now. Or maybe she just pushed harder. Inside, the air felt colder than the day before. Not by much. Just enough to notice it settling into her coat, slipping under the fabric and resting against her skin. She set the suitcase down near the wall. Rex moved in behind her, pausing again just inside the threshold before stepping fully into the room. His head turned slowly, taking in the space as if confirming that it hadn't changed overnight. Marlene unzipped the suitcase. The sound was louder than it should have been. She pulled out a sweater, then another, stacking them on one of the desks. A pair of worn boots. A small blanket. The photograph, still wrapped, she set aside carefully. There wasn't much, but it was enough to begin. She walked to the back of the room and stood there, looking at the wall where the plaster had cracked more deeply than the others. That was where she would start. Marlene rolled up the sleeves of her coat and found a loose edge with her fingers. The plaster felt brittle, dry, ready to give if pushed the right way. She pressed. A small section broke free. It fell to the floor in a soft crumble, sending a thin cloud of dust into the air. She coughed once, stepping back, waving her hand slightly in front of her face. Rex watched from a few feet away, his ears flicking at the sound. Marlene stepped forward again. This time she pulled harder. The plaster came away in a larger piece, revealing the thin wooden strips beneath, the lath, old, uneven, but still holding. Behind that, something darker. Packed material. She paused, then reached in and pulled a piece free. It was paper. Old newspaper, yellowed and fragile, crumpled into tight shapes and pressed between the wooden supports. She turned it over in her hands. The print was faded, but still visible. Words she couldn't quite make out. Dates she didn't try to read. She set it aside and pulled another and another. The work was slow. Each section required a different kind of pressure. Some pieces came away easily. Others resisted, breaking into smaller fragments that fell through her fingers. Dust settled on her sleeves, her hands, her face. She didn't stop. Not because she was in a hurry, but because stopping would make her feel the cold again. The quiet. The weight of being there alone. So she kept moving. By mid-afternoon, a small section of the wall had been cleared. The exposed area looked rough, uneven, but solid underneath. Marlene stepped back, catching her breath. Her hands ached. Her shoulders felt tight. She wiped her palms against her coat, leaving faint streaks of dust behind. Rex had moved closer at some point. He lay near the entrance, his body angled toward the door, but his head turned toward her. His eyes followed her movements, steady and calm, but not relaxed, not completely. Every so often, he would lift his head slightly, ears shifting, as if listening for something just beyond what she could hear. Marlene noticed it. She didn't comment on it. Not yet. She walked over to the window and wiped a section of the glass with the sleeve of her coat. The outside came into clearer view, fields stretching out, the line of trees, the road in the distance. Still no movement, still no one else, just space. She leaned her forehead lightly against the glass for a moment. The cold from it pressed into her skin. Then she straightened and turned back to the room. The sun had shifted lower now, the light coming in at a different angle, stretching longer across the floor. The building felt different in that light. Not warmer, just more defined. Like it was revealing itself in pieces. Marlene walked back to the wall. She picked up another section of plaster and tested its edge. It gave. She pulled. More paper. More dust. More of the same steady, repetitive work. Behind her, Rex stood up. He moved slowly across the room, his nails clicking softly against the floor. He paused near the wall she was working on, just a few feet away. His head tilted slightly. Then he lay down. Right there. Not near the door, not near her suitcase. There. Marlene glanced at him. "You tired?" she asked quietly. Rex didn't move. His eyes stayed on the wall. Marlene looked back at the exposed section, then at him again. She didn't think much of it. Not yet. She just nodded once, more to herself than anything else, and went back to work. Because for now, that was enough. The wall, the dust, the steady rhythm of pulling something apart, piece by piece, until it made room for something else. And the quiet understanding that this was where she would stay. At least for now. At least long enough to see what it could become. The second day settled in quieter than the first. No questions this time. No standing at the door wondering if she should turn back. Marlene stepped inside like someone returning to a place that had already started to take shape in her mind. The air was still cold, but it didn't feel as sharp. Or maybe she just didn't notice it the same way. She set down a small paper bag she'd brought with her, bread, a thermos, a pair of work gloves she'd picked up from a gas station along the road. Nothing expensive, just what she thought she might need to keep going. Rex entered behind her, pausing again just past the threshold. But this time he didn't scan the whole room. He looked straight toward the back wall, the same place as yesterday. Marlene noticed it again, a little more clearly now. "All right," she said quietly, more to fill the silence than anything else. She pulled on the gloves and walked back to the section she had started. The broken plaster lay scattered on the floor, mixed with strips of old wood and crumpled paper. It looked worse than it had yesterday, but it felt like progress. She bent down and picked up a piece of newspaper. It crumbled slightly in her hand, the edges soft with age. She turned it over, brushing away dust with her thumb. A headline surfaced for a second. Faded ink, letters barely holding together. She didn't try to read it. She set it aside and went back to the wall. The rhythm came easier now. Press, pull, break, clear. Each motion led into the next without much thought. The wall gave way in sections, revealing more of the same. Lath, packed insulation, dust that settled into everything. Time moved differently inside the building. Not slower, just less noticeable. At some point, the light shifted again. Marlene straightened up and rolled her shoulders, feeling the stiffness begin to settle in. She wiped her hands against the front of her coat, leaving pale streaks across the fabric. Behind her, Rex stood, not moving, not pacing, just standing. Facing the wall. Marlene turned slightly. He wasn't close to her. He wasn't near the door either. He had moved to the side just a few feet from where she had been working and stopped. His body was still. His ears angled forward, not sharply, but with a quiet focus. His eyes fixed on a single point. Marlene followed his gaze. It landed on a section of wall she hadn't touched yet. Nothing about it looked different. Same cracked surface, same faded paint, same small lines running through the plaster where time had settled in. "What is it?" she asked softly. Rex didn't look at her. He took a slow step forward, then another, and stopped again. Marlene walked over. The floor creaked under her weight, the sound echoing faintly in the open room. She stood beside him, close enough to feel the tension in his posture. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't alert in the way he was outside, watching the road or listening for movement. This was different, focused, contained. Marlene reached out and tapped the wall lightly with her knuckles. A dull sound came back. She tapped again, a few inches to the side. Same sound. Then she moved slightly, tapping closer to where Rex stood. The sound changed. Not much. Just enough. Less solid. Less certain. She paused. Tapped again. There it was. A hollow note, faint but distinct. Marlene frowned slightly. She tapped along the surface, moving slowly, listening. Solid. 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 Then, that same hollow shift. Rex let out a low sound. Not loud, not aggressive, just a quiet vibration in his chest, barely audible, but different from anything she had heard from him before. Marlene looked down at him. He didn't move, didn't bark, just held his position, eyes still on the wall. "You hear something?" she asked. He didn't answer, of course, but he didn't back away either. Marlene reached for the edge of the plaster, where a small crack had already formed. She pressed. It didn't give right away. She pressed harder. The surface shifted slightly under her hand. A faint line widened. Dust fell. She stepped back for a second, adjusting her grip, then pushed again, using more force this time. The plaster broke. A small section came loose, falling to the floor with a soft, brittle sound. Marlene crouched down, brushing away the loose pieces. Behind it, the same wooden strips, the same packed material. At first. Then something else. She leaned closer. Her hand moved slowly, clearing away the paper and debris. The space between the studs was tighter here, more compact, as if something had been pressed into it deliberately. Marlene paused. Her fingers hovered just above the opening. Rex shifted slightly beside her, lowering his head, his nose close to the exposed section. He didn't touch it. Just stayed there. Watching. Waiting. Marlene felt her breath slow without meaning to. The room seemed quieter than before. Even the wind outside had dropped off, leaving only the faintest sound against the walls. She reached in. Carefully. Her fingers brushed against something solid. Not wood, not paper. Something else. Flat. Cool. She pulled her hand back slightly, then reached in again, adjusting her angle. Her fingers closed around the edge of it. Metal. Marlene stopped. Just for a second. Then she tightened her grip and pulled. The object slid free with a soft scraping sound, dislodging bits of paper and dust as it came out. She sat back on her heels, holding it in both hands. A small tin. Old rust along the edges. The kind of container that had once held something ordinary. Now it didn't feel ordinary at all. Marlene stared at it. Rex sat beside her, his posture easing just slightly, as if something that had been held in place had finally shifted. Marlene turned the tin over in her hands. It wasn't heavy. But it wasn't empty either. She looked back at the wall, then at the tin again. Something about it didn't fit. Not with the rest of the building, not with the dust and the decay and the years that had passed. This hadn't ended up there by accident. She brushed her thumb along the lid. Paused. Then slowly, carefully, she began to open it. The lid resisted at first. Not locked. Just stuck. Marlene pressed her thumb along the edge, feeling the rough line where the metal had sealed itself over time. She worked it gently, not forcing it, letting it loosen the way old things sometimes do, slowly, reluctantly. It gave with a faint click, a small sound. But in the stillness of the room, it felt louder. Marlene lifted the lid. Inside, folded neatly, was paper. Not newspaper, not scraps. Bills, old ones. She stared for a moment without touching them. Then she reached in and lifted the stack out. The edges were worn but intact. The paper felt thinner than the kind she was used to now, softer somehow, like it had aged into something more fragile, but more certain at the same time. She unfolded one. $10. Another. 5. Another. 20. Marlene let out a quiet breath. It wasn't a large amount, not enough to change anything by itself. But it wasn't nothing. And more than that, it didn't belong there. Rex shifted beside her, lowering himself to the floor, his head still angled toward the wall. His posture had eased just slightly, but his attention hadn't moved. Marlene looked at him, then back at the wall. She turned the tin over in her hands again. It wasn't marked. No name, no date, nothing to explain why it had been placed there. She set it down carefully on the floor beside her. Then she leaned forward again. The opening in the wall was still small, just enough to reach in. She brushed away more of the paper insulation, her movements slower now, more deliberate. The dust rose in thin lines around her fingers, catching the light for a second, before settling again. Her hand moved deeper into the space. Empty. Just wood. She pulled back. Sat there for a moment, thinking. Then she shifted to the side and tapped along the wall again. Solid. Solid. Then set. That same hollow note. A little lower this time. Marlene turned her head slightly, listening. Rex's ears flicked. He didn't move. She moved her hand down the wall, pressing lightly against the surface, feeling for any difference she could detect without seeing it. There. A slight give, not visible, just enough to notice. Marlene reached for another crack, smaller this time, and pressed. The plaster broke away in a thin line. She widened it with her fingers, careful not to push too hard, letting the material fall away in pieces. More paper. More dust, then something else. Her fingers brushed against another solid edge. She paused again, then reached in. This time she knew what she was feeling. Another container. She pulled it out slowly, smaller than the first. Darker. A different kind of tin, maybe once holding mints or tobacco. She set it beside the first. Her hands were steadier now. Not because she understood what was happening, but because something inside her had shifted. From confusion to attention. She opened the second tin. More bills, different denominations. Folded the same way, placed the same way. Not random, not forgotten. Marlene exhaled slowly. Her eyes moved from the tins to the wall, then back again. This isn't, she started, then stopped. There wasn't a word for it yet. Rex stood. He stepped forward again, closer to the wall, then stopped in nearly the same spot as before. Not moving, not reacting, just present. Marlene looked at the section she had opened, then at the wall around it. There were no markings, no signs, Nothing that would tell her where to look next. But now she knew something was there. Not just once, not just in one place. She reached for another section. This time she didn't hesitate. Her hands moved faster, but not careless. She followed the same pattern: press, pull, clear, working outward from where she had already opened the wall. The plaster came away in uneven chunks. The paper followed, and behind it, another space, another hidden pocket. Her fingers found it before her eyes did. A small glass jar this time, sealed tight. She pulled it free and held it up to the light. Inside, coins, old ones, stacked loosely, shifting with a soft, metallic sound as she tilted the jar. Marlene let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She set it down beside the others. Then she leaned back, sitting fully on the floor now. The room felt different. Not warmer, not brighter, but changed. The stillness had shifted into something else, not silence. Expectation. Rex lay down again beside her, this time closer, his shoulder touching her leg. He let out a slow breath, his head lowering just slightly, but his eyes still open. Marlene looked at him. "You knew," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. He didn't respond, but he didn't look away either. Marlene turned back to the wall. 3 finds, 3 separate places, all hidden, all placed deliberately. She reached out and ran her hand lightly over the exposed section. There would be more. She didn't know how many. She didn't know why, but she knew this wasn't the end of it. Not even close. Marlene pushed herself to her feet slowly, her knees stiff from the cold floor. She brushed the dust from her coat, though it didn't make much difference. Her eyes moved across the room. The other walls, the untouched sections, the places she hadn't looked yet. Her breathing steadied, not faster, not slower, just focused. Rex stood as she did, staying close. This time, when he looked at the wall, it wasn't with tension. It was with something quieter, as if whatever had drawn him there had begun to unfold. Marlene picked up one of the tins and held it for a moment longer. Then he set it back down carefully. Because now, it wasn't just something she had found. It was something that had been waiting. And she had only just begun to see it. The room didn't feel empty anymore. That was the first thing Marlene noticed. Nothing had changed on the surface. The same desks, the same chalkboard, the same pale light stretching across the floor in quiet lines. But the space held something now. Not sound. Not movement. Something else. Marlene stood still for a moment, looking at the section of wall she had opened. The exposed wood, the torn paper, the small cluster of objects laid carefully on the floor beside her. 3 containers, 3 separate places, and no reason for them to be there. She exhaled slowly, then turned back to the wall. If there were 3, there would be more. The work changed after that. It wasn't just clearing damaged plaster anymore. It was searching, not in a frantic way, not tearing the place apart, but deliberate, measured. She moved along the wall in sections, tapping lightly before she touched anything, listening for that same subtle difference in sound. Solid. Solid, then hollow. Each time she found it, the feeling returned. A quiet shift in her chest. Not excitement. Not exactly. Something closer to recognition. The next one came quicker. A few feet to the left of the first. She broke through the plaster with less hesitation now, clearing away the lath and paper until her fingers brushed against another hidden shape. A small canvas pouch, tied with a thin cord. Inside, coins again, but different, larger, heavier, some worn smooth, others still carrying faint impressions she couldn't quite make out. She set it beside the others. Didn't count them. Didn't need to. That wasn't the point anymore. Rex stayed close. Closer than before. He no longer paced or circled the room. He followed her movements, stopping when she stopped, watching the walls the way he had watched the house that morning. Focused, quiet, aware of something just beneath the surface. At one point, he moved ahead of her. Just a step. Then stopped. Turned his head slightly. And waited. Marlene walked over. Tapped the wall where he stood. Solid. She tapped again, a few inches over. There. That same hollow shift. She nodded, more to herself than anything else, and began to work. "You've got a better ear than I do," she said softly. Rex didn't move, but he stayed. The pattern began to form. Not random, not scattered. Placed. Each container tucked into its own space, not too close to the others, but not too far apart either. Different heights, different sizes, some easier to reach, some deeper, requiring more effort to uncover, as if someone had been working slowly. Over time, adding one, then another, then another. Marlene paused at one point, sitting back on her heels, her hands resting loosely in her lap. Her breathing had steadied into a rhythm that matched the work. The room felt warmer now. Or maybe she just wasn't noticing the cold anymore. She looked at the row of items beside her. Tin jar pouch, another tin, another jar, each one slightly different, none of them labeled, none of them explained, but all of them intentional. She reached for one of the jars and turned it in her hands. The glass was thick, slightly clouded with age. Inside, the contents shifted softly, coins and folded bills, packed together without much space to move. She set it back down. Carefully, almost respectfully. Because now, it didn't feel like she was uncovering something forgotten. It felt like she was uncovering something kept. The afternoon light shifted again, stretching longer across the floor, catching the edges of the exposed wall and the objects beside it. Dust moved slowly through the air, rising and settling with each movement she made. Rex lay down near her again, this time fully relaxed, not asleep, but not tense, his breathing slow, even. Every so often, his ears would flick slightly, adjusting to sounds she couldn't hear. But he didn't move away. He didn't need to. Whatever had drawn him to that first spot, it had spread. Or maybe it had always been there. And now she was just beginning to see it. Marlene stood and walked across the room, her legs stiff from hours on the floor. She stopped near the chalkboard, looked at it again. The faint traces of old writing, the worn edges where hands had brushed past it countless times. Then she turned and looked back at the walls, at the sections still untouched, at the places she hadn't opened yet. Her eyes moved slowly, taking it all in. This wasn't just a few hidden things. This was something larger, something built. Piece by piece over time. She walked back to the section she had been working on and knelt again. Her hands moved with more certainty now, not guessing. Following. The next find came deeper, harder to reach. A small wooden box wedged tightly between two studs. It took time to pull free. When she finally held it in her hands, she paused. Not because it was heavy, but because it felt different, more deliberate. more personal. She opened it. Inside, not money, at least not only, a small folded piece of paper, carefully placed, wrapped in something that had once been cloth, now worn thin with age. Marlene didn't open it right away. She just looked at it, then at the rest of the items around her. Coins, bills, containers, and now something else. She set the box down slowly. Her hands rested on her knees. Her eyes moved across the room again. This time the building didn't feel empty at all. It felt full. Not crowded, not overwhelming, just layered. As if everything that had been placed inside these walls had stayed there on purpose. Waiting. Not for anyone. For someone. Marlene drew in a slow breath, then let it out. She didn't rush to open the folded paper. Not yet. Because now she understood something she hadn't before. This wasn't just about what was hidden. It was about why it had been hidden. And that answer was still somewhere inside the walls. Marlene didn't move for a long moment. Her hands rested on her knees, the small wooden box still open beside her, the folded paper inside untouched. The room had gone quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. This one felt closer, as if something had drawn nearer just out of sight. Rex lifted his head. Not sharply, just enough to shift his attention. He wasn't looking at the wall she had been working on anymore. He was looking toward the front of the room, toward the chalkboard. Marlene followed his gaze. The board stretched across the wall, dark and worn, its surface marked faintly with the shadows of words that had long since been erased. It had been there the entire time, steady and unchanged, holding its place at the front like it always had. She stood slowly. Her legs protested at first, stiff from hours on the floor, but she steadied herself and took a step forward. Rex rose with her. He moved ahead this time, not rushing, not pulling, just leading by a quiet step, his path clear, his focus fixed. Marlene walked behind him. The floor creaked softly beneath them, the sound echoing just enough to remind her how empty the space had been before. Rex stopped a few feet from the chalkboard. He didn't sit, didn't lie down. He stood there, head angled slightly, ears forward, his body still in that same quiet, attentive way she had come to recognize. Marlene reached the wall. She stood beside him and looked at the board. Nothing about it seemed different. The same worn edges, the same faint lines, the same presence it had held since the moment she stepped inside. But now she was looking at it differently. She reached out and placed her hand against the surface. The chalkboard felt cooler than the plaster. Smoother. Solid. She tapped lightly. A dull sound came back. She tapped again, a little to the side. Still solid. Marlene frowned slightly. Rex shifted beside her, just a small movement, his head lowering an inch, then lifting again. She stepped back, looked at the edges, the frame, the way it sat against the wall. It wasn't flush, not completely. There was a slight gap along one side, barely noticeable. But there. Marlene reached for the edge of the frame and pressed. Nothing. She tried again, this time with both hands, applying more pressure. The board didn't move, but something behind it did. Just slightly. A faint shift. She stopped. Her breath slowed. Then she tried again. This time the board gave, not fully, just enough to confirm it wasn't fixed in place. Marlene stepped back and looked at it again. Then she slid her fingers along the edge until she found a spot where the wood felt thinner, more worn. She pressed there. Harder. The board shifted. A narrow gap opened between it and the wall behind. Dust fell in a thin line. Rex stepped back, giving her space, but his eyes never left the opening. Marlene gripped the edge of the board and pulled. It resisted for a second. Then, it moved. The sound was soft but clear. Wood against wood. Something that had been still for a long time finally letting go. The chalkboard swung slightly outward, revealing the space behind it. Marlene froze. The cavity was larger than the others. Deeper, wider. And inside, a single object. Not scattered. Not hidden among layers. Placed. Deliberately. An envelope. Cream-colored once, now faded with age, its edges worn but intact. It rested against the back of the cavity, untouched by dust, protected by the board that had covered it for decades. Marlene reached in. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment pressing into it. She took the envelope and pulled it free. It was light, thinner than she expected, but it held something. She stepped back and let the chalkboard settle into place behind her. The room felt smaller now, more focused, as if everything had been leading to this one point. Rex moved closer, his body brushing lightly against her side. Marlene looked down at the envelope. There was writing on the front, faded, but still legible. To whoever finds this. She swallowed. Her fingers moved slowly along the edge, breaking the seal with care, as if anything too sudden might disturb what had been kept inside for so long. She opened it. Inside was a letter, folded neatly. The paper was thin, almost translucent at the creases, but it held together as she unfolded it. Marlene lowered herself to the floor again without thinking. The envelope rested beside her, the letter in her hands. She began to read. The handwriting was steady. Careful. Each word placed with intention. She didn't rush, didn't skim. She read every line. Then she read it again. The room didn't move. The light didn't change. Even the air seemed to hold itself still. When she finished the second time, she lowered the paper slightly, her eyes lingering on the last line. Her hands rested in her lap. The letter lay open. Rex leaned in just slightly, his head close as if he understood that whatever was in that paper mattered. Marlene looked around the room. The walls, the desks, the chalkboard, the places she had opened, the things she had found. And now, this. The answer hadn't been hidden among the many. It had been set apart, saved, protected. Not meant to be found quickly, but meant to be found eventually. Marlene drew in a slow breath, then let it out. She folded the letter carefully along its original lines and placed it back inside the envelope. Not to put it away, just to hold it together. For a moment longer, she sat there on the floor, the envelope resting in her hands, the weight of it far greater than the paper itself. Rex settled beside her, his body relaxed now in a way it hadn't been since they first arrived. The room felt different again. Not full, not empty, but understood. The light had begun to fade by the time Marlene stood up again. It moved slowly across the floor, pulling itself away from the far wall and settling into longer, thinner shapes. The room felt quieter now, not because it was silent, but because there was nothing left pulling at it. nothing left hidden. Marlene held the envelope in both hands for a moment longer, then walked over to one of the desks and set it down carefully. Not tucked away, not hidden again, just placed, where it could stay. Rex followed her, his steps softer now, less measured. He no longer stopped to watch the walls, no longer held himself in that quiet tension that had followed him since they first arrived. He lay down near the door, not guarding it, just resting. Marlene noticed that. She stood there, looking at him, then back at the room. The building felt different again. Not waiting anymore, not holding something back. Just there, open. The next weeks passed in small, steady pieces. Marlene didn't rush. There was no reason to. Each day began the same way. The drive out, the door opening, the quiet shift as she stepped inside. She worked with what she had, clearing the rest of the walls carefully, not searching now, just finishing what had been started. Each section revealed the same pattern, spaces that had once held something, now empty, their purpose already fulfilled. She gathered the containers and set them aside, one by one. Cleaned what she could. Kept what mattered. The money stayed in a small, locked box she kept near her things, not counted every day, not worried over. It was there. That was enough. The letter remained on the desk, sometimes folded, sometimes open. She didn't read it every day, but she knew what it said. And that didn't change. The repairs came slowly. A borrowed set of tools from a man she met at the edge of town who didn't ask many questions. A bundle of wood left near the road one morning without a note. A small heater she found at a thrift store, enough to take the edge off the cold nights. The work wasn't perfect. The walls didn't come out smooth the first time. The floor creaked in places she couldn't fix yet, but it held. That was what mattered. It held. People began to notice. Not all at once, just in passing. A car slowing down on the road, a wave from someone she hadn't met. A woman who stopped one afternoon and left a folded blanket on the porch rail without knocking. Marlene didn't ask questions. She nodded when she saw them. That was enough. Rex changed too. Not suddenly, not in a way that could be pointed to, but gradually. He no longer stood at the walls, no longer listened for something beneath the surface. He stayed near the door, or by her side, or stretched out in the patch of sunlight that moved across the floor each afternoon. Calm. Steady. Like whatever had drawn his attention before had settled into place. His work, whatever it had been, was done. Winter came early. The first snow fell in quiet, wide flakes that didn't rush. They drifted down slowly, covering the ground in a thin layer that softened everything it touched. Marlene stood just inside the doorway, watching it. The air inside the schoolhouse was warmer now. Not perfect, but enough. The heater hummed softly in the corner. The walls, patched and reinforced, held back the wind. The space felt smaller than it had at first, but in a way that made sense, in a way that fit. Rex lay near the door, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed but still aware of her movements. Marlene stepped out onto the porch. The snow had already begun to gather along the edges, collecting in the corners, settling into the lines of the wood. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself and sat down on the top step. The world was quiet. Not empty, just still. She looked out across the field, now covered in white, the trees standing dark against the sky. No cars, No voices, just space and time. Behind her, the schoolhouse stood, not leaning as much anymore, not forgotten, just there, holding. Marlene rested her hands in her lap. For a moment she closed her eyes, not to block anything out, just to feel the stillness settle in. Then she opened them again and looked back toward the door. The light from inside spilled out softly, catching the falling snow in small shifting patterns. Warm against the cold. She stood and stepped back inside, closed the door behind her. Rex lifted his head slightly as she passed, then let it rest again. Marlene walked to the center of the room and stopped. The desk, the chalkboard, the walls. Everything that had been there from the beginning. And everything that had changed. She reached out and rested her hand lightly against one of the walls. Solid. Steady. No hollow spaces left. Nothing hidden. Nothing waiting. Just what was there. She let her hand fall back to her side and stood there for a moment longer. Quiet. Present. Then she turned toward the desk where the envelope still rested. She didn't pick it up. She didn't need to, because she already understood. Sometimes, what's taken from you doesn't leave a hole. Sometimes, it clears a path, not a straight one, not an easy one, but one that leads somewhere you wouldn't have found otherwise. Marlene moved to the window and looked out once more at the snow. Then she turned back into the room and stayed. The fire in the small heater clicked softly as it settled, the kind of sound you only notice when everything else has gone quiet. Snow pressed gently against the windows now, dulling the outside world until it felt far away, like something she had already stepped out of. Rex shifted near the door, not watching the walls anymore, not listening for anything hidden. Just there. Calm. Certain. Marlene stood in the middle of the room looking at the places she had opened. The marks were still there if you knew where to look. Slight differences in the plaster. Lines that didn't quite match the rest. Nothing perfect.
Nothing erased, but nothing waiting either. She talked about that first moment, him standing by that wall, refusing to move, like he could feel something she couldn't, like he knew there was more here than what showed on the surface. She almost ignored it. That bag stayed with her longer than anything else. Not the money, not even the letter. That she almost walked back, the only thing that had been trying to show her the truth. Marlene reached out and rested her hand against the wall again. It felt solid now, finished, like it had finally given up what it had been haunting. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she had been pushed somewhere. She felt like she had been led, not by chance, not even by herself, but by something steady enough to notice what she couldn't. Rex let out the quiet breath and closed his eye. Marlene looked down at him, then back at the room, and she wondered how many things in her life had tried to tell her where to go, and she just didn't stay long enough to listen.